When faced with a mystery, the human brain sometimes likes to fill the lack of facts with its own fantastic tales of murderous intrigue and dramatic daring do, but reality is usually much simpler than that. I want to make one thing clear before I start this documentary. Even though we will touch on it briefly, it is not all about how Brian Jones was, quote, murdered by an angry home contractor. I'm aware of the theory, and there are just too many conflicting reports to make a definitive documentary about it. What this film will attempt to cover, however, are the events over the course of the early career of the Rolling Stones that led to Brian's receding from the artistic direction of the group, his crippling depression and self-medication, and eventually his untimely death at the age of 27. Today we'll try to answer the question, who really killed Brian Jones? Next on If Guitars Could Speak. Hello all, and welcome back to If Guitars Could Speak, the documentary series where we examine famous musicians, cool pieces of gear, and amazing stories from rock and roll history. Today we will be chronicling the last few years of the life of Brian Jones, talented multi-instrumentalist and founder of the Rolling Stones. Jones's eventual death is shrouded in mystery, but I believe that it's more important to zoom out from that tiny moment in history to look at the big picture. The people who surrounded Brian in those early years of success, and who ultimately would cut him out of the band that he founded, and then failed to help him as his substance abuse problems and depression slowly killed him. But remember, if you like rock history content like this, please remember to subscribe to my channel, The Guitar Historian, where there are dozens of documentaries just like this. Also, remember to hit the like button below to let YouTube know that you think other rock history fans would like to see this. I think that most people know the legends surrounding the formation of the Rolling Stones, but you may not know that the Stones were just one branch from a tree that was planted by early blues musicians like Alexis Korner, often called the father of British blues. Korner was toiling away as a professional musician at a time when the Beatles were still the Quarrymen and still playing in basement clubs. This culminated in Korner eventually splitting from bandleader Chris Barber to form his own group, Blues Incorporated, in 1961. The blues explosion in the UK happened almost concurrently with the explosion of pop rock groups like the Beatles, and propped up an alternative and more authentic avenue that actually ended up becoming a bulk of the British invasion acts. Indeed, almost all of the bands that ended up following the Beatles into America after '64 had an R&B background. Blues Incorporated and later groups like John Mayall's Blues Breakers, Manfred Mann, the Yardbirds, and even more jazz-inspired groups like the Graham Bond Organization would become revolving doors for some of the greatest musicians in the UK, many of whom would go on to form massive groups of their own later in the 60s. But the earliest offshoot that saw major success were the Rolling Stones, with Brian Jones pulling talent from the many musicians that he'd met through his membership in Blues Incorporated. Brian was known primarily for his slide guitar work at this time. Initially, pianist Ian Stewart and later vocalist Mick Jagger and guitarist Keith Richards responded to Jones's call to form the new group. An early form of the Stones would play their first gig at the Marquee Club in London on 12 July 1962, and would swiftly gain a following as a dynamic young band in the R&B scene. For about a year, Jones, Jagger, and Keith Richards would share a flat in Chelsea that Keith would dub a beautiful dump. A fourth flatmate was photographer James Felge, whose name would come to be used as a pseudonym on some early Stones records. This was a time of great musical camaraderie between the trio, with Jones and Richards eating up every blues and R&B record that they could get their hands on, as well as Jones teaching Mick Jagger how to play the harmonica. Bassist Bill Wyman came a few months later, and the fact that he had a spare Vox AC30 laying around definitely helped his chances. Finally, nearly a year after the band was formed, it was able to coax well-traveled and respected jazz drummer Charlie Watts from behind his throne in Blues Incorporated. With that, in January of 1963, the lineup of the Rolling Stones, famously named in a panic by Jones's use of a Muddy Waters tune, was complete. During this time, Brian Jones was the unquestionable leader of the group. He also acted as the band's manager, receiving a slightly higher pay than the rest of the members. Charlie Watts remembered, quote, "Brian was very instrumental in pushing the band at the beginning. Keith and I would look at him and say he was barmy. It was a crusade to him to get us on the stage in a club and be paid $500 and to be billed as an R&B band. Barmy or not, Brian's penchant for leadership seemed to rub his bandmates the wrong way, as he was sometimes known as abrasive, bossy, and self-indulgent. Jones's shenanigans would only deepen the divide when the band began working with manager Giorgio Gomelski, who also received pay and took over much of the booking and publicity work for the Stones. But a sea change in the fortune of the Stones would come in May 1963 when they would sign 19-year-old Andrew Loog Oldham as their manager. Oldham, not yet old enough to sign his own contracts, had to take on a partner to effectively negotiate for and manage the band. But despite his age, Oldham made some shrewd and savvy moves for the Stones and was able to procure them several favorable terms. First, Oldham targeted Decca's A&R man Dick Rowe, who had famously told Brian Epstein that, quote, "guitar groups are on the way out," when he had the chance to sign the Beatles. Stinging at that failure, Rowe and Decca gave the Stones a higher cut of record sales than the Fab Four and allowed them to record at non-Decca studios. But Oldham was just getting started with his total transformation of the Stones. Despite a dubious and thankfully short stint in which Oldham tried to get the band into matching suits like their Merseyside counterparts, Oldham quickly saw the Stones as a counterpoint to the Beatles, making the Stones into a, quote, "raunchy, gamey, unpredictable group of undesirables." He ditched pianist Ian Stewart, saying that his look as a burly older Scot didn't fit with his vision of a young group of slim Englishmen. For the whole rundown on Stewart's ouster from the band, you can see my earlier episode right up here. Oldham also began to find ways to creatively make more money off of his management of the Stones, like calling himself the producer while not actually knowing how to produce, and horning in on the writing royalties of some of the Stones' early singles through a dummy writing credit called Nanker Felge, of which Oldham shared a byline with the rest of the group on songs such as Little by Little and Play with Fire. But a major misstep was Oldham's eagerness to bring the Stones to America in June of 1964, before the band had gained the notoriety or hit records that the Beatles had. Even though the band grumbled about some of these moves, Oldham's changes were overwhelmingly successful in the long run, but the biggest change was yet to come. With his push to get the Stones to produce more of their own material, Oldham inadvertently, or perhaps advertently, is that a word? Started to push Brian out of his leadership spot in the band. Jones was not known as a natural songwriter, and although he was known to occasionally write songs, he was usually very private about showing them to his bandmates. In fact, Jagger and Richards have both said over the years that the songs Brian did bring to the band were often incomplete and weak. And so Oldham turned his attention to the future Glimmer twins, Jagger and Richards, to be his songwriting team. Oldham felt that the band would make little money continuing to record R&B standards. So by 1965, the pair were slowly gaining traction and writing stronger songs, and as a result were taking the band in a new direction with a more pop sensibility. Even though I would say the Stones never really lost their swagger, writing songs for the pop charts was just not what Brian Jones got into music to do. He was a blues purist and he was not at home in the new regime. Of course, that doesn't mean that Brian was invisible. His talents as both a guitarist and multi-instrumentalist are all over the early Stones records. Just because he might not have been happy about the musical direction of the group didn't mean he didn't spice up their sound with tons of amazing contributions. His slide guitars everywhere early on, most notably for me on I'm a King Bee and of course No Expectations. He played the tricky little lead riff in The Last Time, the recorder on Ruby Tuesday, the sitar on Paint It Black. He played the mellotron and the organ on a bunch of tracks. One of my favorites is the Appalachian dulcimer he played on Lady Jane. He even lent his talent to the Beatles on alto sax for You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, and to Jimi Hendrix a few times. That thwack sound you hear at the end of each bar and all along the Watchtower, that was Brian playing an instrument called the vibraslap. Brian was also a wicked harmonica player, and most of the harp used early on in the Stones records are Brian playing. But despite this, Brian still did not like the musical direction of the band that he created, and he was never able to stand back and realize that the creation was becoming bigger than he'd envisioned. He saw Oldham's weaving of financial tentacles into all aspects of the Rolling Stones as nothing short of chicanery, and began to become bitterly jealous of the shift of power. According to Oldham's book Stoned, Jones constantly and desperately tried to hold on to power. Oldham said, quote, "He resisted the symbiosis demanded by the group lifestyle, and so life was becoming more desperate for him day by day. None of us were looking forward to Brian totally cracking up." It wasn't just Brian's power that was being taken away, it was also the musical direction that he'd envisioned for the band and his ability to lead as a musician. With Jagger and Richards stepping forward to lead the group musically, Brian found himself with less and less to do. And then there was the Morocco trip. Often cited as the turning point and the straw that broke the camel's back, the Morocco trip in 1967 was the moment that spiritually split the Rolling Stones as Brian Jones's band and turned them into Mick and Keith's band. Or, if you listen to Charlie Watts, his band. But the Morocco trip was born out of the Stones' infamous bust for drugs that the British police force had levied upon the group. Jones, Jagger, and Richards were all raided by Scotland Yard and charged with drug possession in 1967. In the wake of these scandals, Stones management pushed the group to take a break and get out of the country until things blew over. It was decided that the fashionable and exotic yet posh and civilized locale of Morocco was a perfect temporary escape. Best yet, Brian was already a pro, having visited the country in the past. The band probably saw it as an opportunity to hang out and rediscover some of their old camaraderie. But unfortunately, Brian fell seriously ill just before the trip was set to begin and had to be hospitalized. Jones's girlfriend Anita Pallenberg and Keith Richards decided to go on ahead and wait for Brian to recover, but they kind of sort of fell in love instead. I'm sure Brian sensed something was amiss, and he would call Anita back to his side. And even though she did come back, he knew something had happened in the last few days as her attitude towards him had completely changed. Rather than playing out like a rediscovery of friendship, the trip became a war of attrition for Brian, whose mania and depression and his lack of control over the band, and now even his girlfriend, was sending him to the edge of insanity. The only way Brian knew how to cope with the pain was through substance abuse. He spent the rest of the trip in a hallucinogenic haze as Keith and Anita moved in together, beginning a relationship that would last 12 years. Jones was completely disconnected from the group physically, emotionally, spiritually, and artistically. Jones did record with some local musicians in a style known as jujuka, and he became darkly obsessed with the music's trance-like style. He was so disconnected, in fact, that the Stones would simply pack up and leave Morocco without him, and Jones would come back weeks later in a drug-induced stupor. Brian's mood and tenor would swing wildly back and forth, sometimes being outgoing and generous, and other times becoming surly, self-obsessed, and cruel. When he was sober enough to function, his relationship with the band at this time could be called simply professional at best. The Stones would continue to record, mostly without Brian. His last major contributions to the band would be on the 1968 album Beggar's Banquet, on which he made many great contributions, such as the aforementioned Slide on No Expectations and the marimbas on Sympathy for the Devil. In December, Brian would attend the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus show, which the band had intended to film as a companion piece to their new album. I did a full rundown about the circus right here, but suffice to say that Brian's attendance that night was only physical in nature. His spirit was elsewhere. Jethro Tull's Ian Anderson said of Brian, quote, "He was well past his sell-by date by then." Despite Brian's seeming coming implosion, he would purchase an estate in East Sussex called Cotchford Farms, once owned by Winnie the Pooh author A.A. Milne. Alexis Corner would visit Brian late that year after he'd moved in and reported that Brian seemed to be, quote, the happiest he'd ever been, and he seemed to be taken with the childlike innocence of the estate. But as the band loped into 1969, the rest of the Stones felt that they had an elephant on their backs. Brian's musical contributions continued to become more and more sporadic despite still showing up to recording sessions from time to time. But he was simply in no state to actually contribute music. For those brief times that he was able, he would play the auto harp on You Got the Silver and percussion on Midnight Rambler. But things came to a head when the band was scheduled for a photo shoot in May, when Mick Jagger told Brian that he would be fired if he didn't turn up for it. Brian did come to the shoot on 21 May 1969, which would be his final with the band. Looking at the photos, it is obvious the state that Brian is in. Frail and delicate, it looks as though Brian is one stiff breeze away from falling over. As the Stones prepared for a U.S. tour later that year, They knew that Brian would be in no condition to play. That, coupled with several legal issues that Brian was facing for drug possession, hampered his ability to obtain a U.S. visa. So, on 8 June 1969, Keith, Mick, and Charlie visited Brian to tell him that the band would be carrying on without him. The Stones allowed Brian a modicum of respect, and he would tell fans that he was leaving to pursue other projects, and per Brian's statement that he, quote, no longer sees eye to eye with the others over the discs we are cutting. The Stones would hire another former Mayall Bluesbreakers guitarist, Mick Taylor, who had followed in the huge shoes of both Eric Clapton and Peter Green. Taylor's tenure with the band would ignite the band's greatest run of albums, starting with his contributions to Finish Let It Bleed and ending with 1974's It's Only Rock and Roll. Brian probably would have liked the direction that the band went into a more bluesy vibe, but tragically Brian wouldn't have to watch his band perform without him for very long. Brian called several friends over the next month like Corner, Ian Stewart, John Lennon, Mitch Mitchell, Alan Price, and Jimmy Miller about putting together a new band, even demoing some of his own songs for the first time. But before any of this could come to fruition, Jones would be found dead in his swimming pool on 3 July 1969. Unable to find any major signs of foul play, the medical examiner would rule his passing as the exceedingly British death by misadventure. In death, Jones would be embalmed, hair bleached white, and buried 10 feet deep in an airtight bronze casket at Cheltenham Cemetery. As a final fitting blow to Jones' relationship with the fellow Stones, only Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts found the time to attend the funeral. The Stones did play a free concert in Hyde Park on 5 July 1969 that they dedicated to Brian, with Mick Jagger reading the Percy Bysshe Shelley poem Adonis before the show. Then they introduced Mick Taylor, Brian's replacement. Over the years, Jones's fellow Stones have presented a mixed bag of emotions regarding the entire situation. In a 1995 interview, Mick was asked if he felt guilt about the way Jones was treated, and he replied, quote, no, I don't really. I do feel that I behaved in a very childish way, but we were very young, and in some ways we picked on him. But unfortunately, he made himself a target for it. He was very, very jealous, very difficult, very manipulative, and if you do that in this kind of a group of people, you get back as good as you give, to be honest. I wasn't understanding enough about his drug addiction. No one seemed to know much about drug addiction. Things like LSD were all new. No one knew the harm. People thought cocaine was good for you. Keith Richards would say, quote, there are some people who you know aren't going to get old. Brian and I agreed that he, Brian, wouldn't live very long. I remember saying, you'll never make 30, man, and he said, I know. Bassist Bill Wyman seemed to be in Brian's corner as the years went on, and he would say, quote, he formed the band. He chose the members. He named the band. He chose the music we played. He got us gigs. He was very influential, very important, and then slowly lost it. Highly intelligent, and just kind of wasted it and blew it all away. In all of these quotes lie the answer to the overall question posed by this video. Who really killed Brian Jones? As with most human stories, the answer is extremely complicated. Years later, as with many unresolved rock and roll stories, a theory would emerge about a home remodeling contractor named Frank Thorogood, who was reportedly owed money by Jones after doing extensive work on Cotchford Farms. Rolling Stones driver Tom Keelock reportedly was told by Thorogood on his deathbed that he did, in fact, kill Brian accidentally during a fight. But this story has been proven and disproven over and over by so many different people, with Keelock himself denying that he was ever told this. So I'll put it like this. If Thorogood did in fact throw Brian in the pool over a dispute over money, leading to his death, does anyone really believe that Brian wouldn't have died in another way shortly after this encounter? I posit that it doesn't really matter. Brian's spirit was already broken, his depression too deep, his substance abuse problem encompassed his every waking moment. Whether he died then, a week from then, a month from then, a year from then, as Keith said, he'd never have made 30. But as a result of dying in 1969, he would of course join the infamous 27 Club, which only poured more fuel on the fire of speculation regarding his death. But again, what truly killed Brian was his inability to adapt and accept a changing landscape within the Stones. Rather than collaborating and growing with the young musicians, he resisted and became bitter and jealous of the other's success. It sounds harsh, but it's the truth, and it needs to be said. That doesn't diminish what Brian did do during his time with the Stones, and of course it doesn't take away the fact that he created the band to begin with. But what the Rolling Stones started out as and what they ended up becoming are two very different things. So in the end, what did we just learn about? We learned about a group of young men, not yet emotionally mature, who didn't know how to properly articulate their feelings to each other. As a result, they silently stewed up resentment between each other, and when it came time for someone to save Brian from himself, no one knew how. This is truly the tragedy of so many rock and roll stories. So many deaths from substance abuse could have been avoided if a friend, somewhere along the line, had the courage and knowledge to step up and reach out a helping hand, rather than turning their back on another friend who was going too far. Hopefully, that's a lesson that might resonate with a few of you. But that's going to be another episode of If Guitars Could Speak. Thank you for joining us on this odyssey into Brian Jones's life and death. Remember to subscribe to the Guitar Historian channel for more rock history just like this, the previous 27 episodes of this series, as well as our flagship series, Forgotten Fretmasters. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.